Hi everybody and welcome to another edition of Kammakast, the videocast where we speak to lots of interesting people about interesting things that impact the real estate and financial services sector. Today I am joined by Ian Pritchett, who is Managing Director of Greencore Construction. You're very welcome to join us today, Ian. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks Orla. Yes.
Would you tell us a little bit more about Greencore, and then we can kind of get stuck into a few of the kind of interesting things that are happening at the moment?
Yes, sure. Greencore was set up back in 2013, and it was really a response to some of the circumstances that were going on at the time. A chap called Martin Pike, who is now our chairman, and myself met up, and we thought it would be a good idea to put some of the things that we've been doing previously into practice by setting up a new company to really challenge the mainstream construction sector. And so we've spent the last 8 years doing research, development, building test houses, pioneering different approaches to building. And over that time, we've now done about 60 houses, which we consider to be proof of concept. And we've gone from doing single houses to a group of 3 to 15 to 25. And earlier this year, we received some major investment from M&G, the big investment fund. So we're ready for the next stage in our journey, which is to scale up and start to really disrupt the industry.
Well, I'm always, we consider ourselves a bit of an innovative disruptor in our space. So I'm always interested to learn a bit more about what is so disruptive about what you're doing, and kind of what was that gap that you saw in 2013 that kind of made you brave enough to jump out on your own and think, there's a big opportunity here.
Well, I think it's the fact that we all know we've got to move towards zero carbon. We've got some pretty strong legislation in terms of the Climate Change Act, which sets this framework and timescale for zero carbon. Yeah. But there isn't really any detail behind it as to how we're going to get there and how we're going to deliver. So the big volume house builders are just carrying on business as usual, emitting lots of carbon and building houses that will need to be upgraded in the near future. And so the opportunity really is for somebody to come in like us and say, well, why don't we do it to the appropriate standard from the first time we build the house, and actually get the carbon footprint down and the emissions in use so that these houses are not going to need retrofitting. So we're really targeting the standards that will need to be in place for 2050. And maybe they'll be in place earlier than 2050, but certainly they'll need to be in place by then.
Much needed. I can see that as a business, well, I think you're going to just be going from strength to strength with kind of the size of the challenge that we have ahead of us. So are your the properties that you develop, are they typically net zero ready then?
They are, yes. So there are 3 elements to what we do. The first is to work on the embodied carbon, the carbon footprint, so that the houses actually lock up at least as much carbon as they emit at the construction stage. And then the second thing is to build them in such a way that they minimize the amount of energy they use. And the third step is to make sure they've got sufficient roof-mounted PVs on them that they can generate as much energy each year as they use. So it's the sort of triple impact of zero embodied carbon or better, very low energy demand, and then meeting that with renewables on the buildings themselves.
Amazing. That really is like the cutting edge of kind of net zero for real estate, isn't it? I'd imagine it's not a straightforward thing. So can you kind of talk me through some of the challenges that you've faced in developing these houses?
Well, It isn't straightforward, but it isn't difficult. So I often say it's a bit like learning to drive or maybe learning to fly an aeroplane. It seems very daunting if you don't know how to do it, but once you've learned how to do it, it's become second nature. So there's nothing that we do that couldn't be adopted by the rest of the industry. It will just take a bit of practice. There's a learning curve. There's a cost associated with going through that learning curve. Yeah. But it's not significant in the scope of the challenge ahead of us.
You're absolutely right, actually, because it is like the theme of net zero is that it is an emerging thing. We've all known for quite some time that we need to be doing more about it, but suddenly there is a very sharp focus on needing to get there, mainly because a lot of governments have woken up and realised that we need to reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030 if we have any hope of hitting net zero by 2050. And then we have this kind of perfect storm of rising fuel bills, and the energy crisis, and that energy becoming an issue of national security that's also kind of suddenly, I guess, accelerated the pace with which the seriousness this has been taken. And I guess if we look at that curve, you're really in the innovator space where you've kind of said, actually, we're willing to invest in learning how to rewrite how we build houses, and we're going to be one of the first ones to do it. And then there'll be you're the innovator, there'll be the early adopters, and then everybody else will probably be dragged kicking and screaming as these things go.
Yes. I think the big question is, when will they be dragged kicking and screaming? Is it this year, 5 years time, or 10 or 15 years time? And that is actually quite significant, because in the meantime they're emitting lots of CO2 into the atmosphere. So we're actually making the problem worse every day, every week that goes by.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually just having this discussion earlier that it's at the moment it's both carrot and stick. So a lot of corporations are starting to realise that their fuel bills are going to become a huge part of their cost base if they don't change their ways. So there's a real kind of bottom line incentive to change, as well as investor pressure. So there's all these quite good kind of private sector factors coming into play, but then of course the government is actually stepping in and putting in some laws and regulations. And I think we probably will hopefully see a lot more of those, and indeed funds being made available to make that happen.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, where do you see the kind of big opportunities in this kind of space for these kind of net zero ready development of property?
So I think, first of all, we've got to move away from this idea of net zero ready. That's where the government legislation is going, which is actually a watering down of saying we need our houses to be net zero. And that's the industry pushing back and saying it's too difficult or too expensive, or we don't know how to do it. So the fudge is to say, well, okay, if we don't know how to do it, let's make them ready for net zero rather than making them net zero. We actually need to make them net zero. And that's really where the opportunity lies. There's a target of building 250 to 300,000 houses a year in this country, and they all need to be net zero. If we're on a roadmap to net zero 2050, at the moment, every new house we build is responsible for, according to the RIBA, around 120 tonnes of emissions at the construction stage, and then it's maybe another 3 to 5 tonnes a year in use. So a house that we build now will be responsible for 200 tonnes of emissions by the time we get to 2050. So you can't really have a zero target in 28 years' time, but still every new house is responsible for 200 tonnes. Sometimes you've actually got to say, we've got to stop making the problem worse. And then when our new houses are net zero, we can then start to focus on upgrading our existing stock. But if we can't even get our new ones to net zero, what chance is there of upgrading the existing stock? So that's where the opportunity is, really. It's an enormous task. And for those businesses that grasp the nettle and learn how to do it earlier, they'll get a bigger share of the market.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, we already have a huge enough mountain to climb with retrofitting existing stock, and if we're continuing to add to that problem by not kind of drawing a hard line on new properties being built, especially when it is, a line has been set in stone for transport where, new petrol or diesel cars, cannot be bought after 2035. So you really, they should be kind of looking at, and I know there's probably a lot of different factors in terms of availability of materials, and there'll be lots of excuses given, but that is really what needs to happen, particularly when I hear you talk about those numbers. It really puts it into stark context about needing to get a bit harsher on that kind of line.
Yes. So you've got a real difference between the automotive industry, which has very, very clear targets and is fully embracing them, and the construction industry that doesn't really have very clear targets, and really the mainstream is a long way from embracing them. And this is because It is a complex subject, but it
Yeah.
suits the industry to allow it to get a little bit confused. So when most people are talking about net zero houses, what they mean is a house that is not responsible for any emissions during operation. Whereas you've got this thing called embodied carbon, which is the amount of emissions that come from the quarrying, extraction, processing, manufacturing, transport, and assembly of materials into making a house. And actually, that's a bigger number in the short term, certainly, than the emissions that come from use. And embodied carbon goes a little bit below the radar. A lot of people aren't really aware of it, and if they are, they choose to ignore it. So we've got no targets or regulation that forces us to measure it, no roadmap for reducing it, and yet it's allegedly responsible for about 10% of all UK CO2 emissions. So it's a big sector.
Huge
And
chunk.
and we really need to fully understand it. And it's not just in housing, everything that gets manufactured has a carbon footprint, it has embodied carbon within it. And so we've got to get on top of that in all sectors, but particularly in construction, because if we're not careful, we will burn through the existing carbon budgets that are allocated without really knowing it.
And how does Greencore deal with embodied carbon?
Well, there are two ways that you can do it, really. So you either need your supply chain to be manufacturing zero carbon products, and that comes from using renewable energy or green hydrogen in the production, and we're quite a long way from that happening at the moment. So the other way, the way that we do, is to use bio-based materials. So trees and plants, when they grow, they absorb carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide gets turned into cellulose through the natural process of photosynthesis. And for every kilogram of cellulose that we can include in a building, it's 1.8 kilos of CO2 that's no longer in the atmosphere. So
Wow.
using sustainable timber, sustainable hemp, and other bio-based materials, you're actually extracting CO2 out of the atmosphere, turning that into a usable product, using it in a building, and replanting more trees, more hemp to capture more CO2. So through doing that, you can actually lock up more carbon in a building than is emitted. So you can get to a better than zero carbon footprint. And there is an organisation called LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, and they have a target that all new buildings should be locking up 100 kilos of CO2 per square metre by 2050. And so there are some enlightened people like Letty who know all about it and have a roadmap and targets. We're at a point where I believe we're now ahead of the Letty 2050 target.
Yeah.
And that's what we intend to do on all of our buildings.
If we just had a few more like you, Ian, sorry, we'd be a lot further along. But that is quite significant when you think about how it sequences carbon from the atmosphere. You know, you mentioned that like a lot of the problem is, you know, when we compare it to the transport industry where there's like very clear measures, very clear targets in place, and whereas for construction, the government's been very vague, particularly around embodied carbon. As you say, no, we're not really talking about it enough. What do you think would be the first steps into putting this higher on the agenda for developers and investors?
Yes, I mean it does get very political. Or the knowledge exists, but there are so many vested interests in trying to make sure that it's not too difficult. And it basically comes down to land value. That the existing volume house building model is based on paying quite a lot of money for land and then building as cheaply as possible in order to maximize profit. And land values are directly related to the money that gets spent on construction. So any higher levels of regulation that might lead to higher construction costs automatically start to drive down land values. And so the volume house builders are very concerned that would make them uncompetitive in acquiring more land in the future. And And that means that none of them really want to break rank and start to do something differently because land is important. So you can start to overcome this by looking at where do we source land and how do we value it. Is government land available to drive this agenda, or the other thing is just to make really, really strong legislation and bring it in really quickly, as we have done in the automotive industry, so that it's a level playing field for everybody. But until it's a level playing field, it makes it very difficult for any of the individual companies to break ranks. And it
Yeah.
means people like us have to try and sort of pick our way through and see how we can manage to find land to build on at higher build prices, not necessarily significantly higher, but a little bit higher, and certainly through the learning curve for all of these companies, they will be higher. I actually don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think that the strength of the vested interests are currently too strong. And we've seen that in the past. Back in 2006, we had a piece of legislation called the Code for Sustainable Homes, which was a roadmap to zero carbon by 2016, albeit that was operational emissions. But the industry managed to lobby pretty hard and they managed to get it scrapped in 2015. And so history tells us that if they lobby hard enough, they'll get these things overturned. So that's why we see relatively weak legislation coming through and continually diluted, because there's a lot of strength in the lobby. But there are things that can be done. We could insist that all new houses are built to the current building regulations when they're built. There's a loophole that's exploited at the moment that they can be built to previous building regulation standards if the project has started or got planning permission in the past. So I think there's a tendency to think that all new houses are built to the current regulations. They're not. They're built to previous regulations, and there's a long lag. We could put financial incentives in place, such as maybe no stamp duty on zero carbon housing, or there's a thing called community infrastructure levy, which is where developers pay towards local infrastructure, and that could be a sliding scale according to how energy efficient the houses are. So if you start to put these financial incentives in place, you'll find the industry will move in that direction anyway, because it will be advantageous to do that. But they're not going to do it on their own.
Yeah, you're right. It is that, going back to the earlier point, it's a combination of carrot and stick. It's probably not helped by the fact that large landowners tend to be quite influential in government as well, so less incentivized to jump on the zero carbon bandwagon. Do you ever see that we may get to a point, and I guess it's kind of about things falling into place a bit more, but where the greenium that's achieved in the future on a net zero property, like the economics of it suddenly start driving the agenda by itself, or do you think that we're like very far away from that being a reality?
No, I think we're beginning to see it now. We're certainly seeing that on some of the larger detached houses, where generally there are more affluent people buying them, and there is a green premium for that. It's a smaller green premium on smaller properties because first-time buyers and less affluent people don't have quite the same power to make that decision.
Yeah.
But I think the current energy crisis will also drive that as well. But we do need the energy market to really reflect the true cost of energy. So we have a policy that's moving us all away from fossil fuels towards electrification, but actually fossil fuels directly and indirectly end up with a lot of subsidies, and electricity gets additional levels of taxation to drive the green agenda. So we need to probably reverse that and start to put the levies for greening our energy onto the types of energy that we're trying to discourage, and making electricity more expensive. So as an example, a unit of electricity is about 3 times the price of a unit of gas. So
Yeah, that's
it
just
isn't
wrong.
just a question of say, well, let's move somebody away from a fossil fuel like gas and move them over to electricity, because low energy and low cost aren't always directly related.
Correlated. Yeah.
So we've got to sort out the energy market as well as decarbonising housing. The two things need to be done hand in hand.
Yeah, in a similar way to the fact that energy and efficiency and carbon emissions tend to follow the same trajectory, but not always. You can have a very well insulated house that's very energy efficient, but it's burning entirely fossil fuels as well. So
Yes.
yeah, making sure
Yeah.
that we get that balance right.
Yes. And the other thing is, houses are very complicated structures, and you can have two identical houses with different types of people living in them, and the energy profile can be very different. We can influence things like heating, hot water, lighting, and ventilation, but we can't always influence the way people live and the other
Yeah.
sorts of energy they're using and what they're using that for as well. So very often the bits that we can influence get lost in the noise of what the overall bills are.
Yeah,
And,
completely.
and so, I think monitoring and understanding how houses are really performing is very important, because no nobody sets out to build a poorly energy efficient house, or to design a poorly performing house. But very often, because it's not monitored, they don't actually know how it is performing. And so it's very easy for people to persuade themselves they really build good quality houses. Getting that post occupancy data is really important to see what's really happening.
Yeah, it is. It's quite a big puzzle with many pieces, really, isn't it? As you say, not it is complex, but it doesn't stop companies like yourselves trailblazing and tackling it. Just to go back to talk about embodied carbon again, because I do find this a fascinating subject. We don't have any accepted standards of how to kind of calculate embodied carbon, which I think is probably one of the problems. I do see that BCIS are trying to solve that problem. Like, what are your thoughts on the subject and the challenges around it?
Yes, I mean, as you say, there are various different methodologies, but there isn't one that's universally accepted. The RICS one is beginning to lead the way, and it is beginning to come into certainly commercial buildings. So
Yeah.
we now see that in London, a whole life embodied carbon assessment is required for new major buildings in London, and that will permeate out, but it needs to be taken into account in all projects everywhere, really. And then within that, at the moment, that's very focused on the carbon emissions, but it's less focused on the carbon that's locked up, the sequestered carbon. So
Yeah.
it does have a module for sequestered carbon, but not everybody's looking at that. But that's really important to see if your carbon is being locked up by trees and plants that are coming from sustainable sources, and you've also got a plan in place for what's going to happen at the end of the life of the building to make sure that's not allowed to be burnt or decompose and that carbon to go back into the
Yeah.
atmosphere, then you can include the sequestered carbon, and that will give you a true picture of what the whole life carbon of the building is. So it's a methodology that's evolving, and I think the RICS methodology and probably some subtle variations of that will start to become established practice over the next few years.
Yeah, I think something that I'm just going to keep watching, because I do find it extremely interesting. And I guess just looking at the cost of building a net zero home or even an extremely energy efficient home versus retrofitting to the same standard, is there a big disparity when you consider, like, should I buy a house and just retrofit it, or maybe I should just start looking at a new build? What are your thoughts on that as well?
Yes, I mean it's a very complex subject, because most new houses that you buy are going to be more energy efficient than an existing house, but they're not going to be zero carbon. They're still going to need a level of upgrading at some time in the future. So if you've got the benefit of the ultimate choice, the best thing would be to buy a new zero carbon house. Now, that's going to be the most cost effective way to do it, because building it in at the beginning and getting it right at the beginning is the cheapest way to do it. Retrofitting our existing buildings, there isn't a one solution that's going to be suitable for all. And there are clearly some buildings that are going to be uneconomic to retrofit. And we either need to be looking at whether we can run those on 100% renewable energy, or whether actually they don't have a future and they're going to have to be demolished and replaced by something that is energy efficient. Now, the reason we're focused on new build is that we firmly believe that the skills needed across the industry are much easier to multiply and learn through getting more and more people involved in new build, and then it will filter out into the retrofit sector. Trying to tackle retrofit from scratch without getting those skills into the industry as a whole is even more difficult. So another reason why we need to drive new build as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, it really adds to the argument for net zero new builds, doesn't it? Because retrofit is going to be so much harder to sort out and much more difficult to achieve economies of scale, whereas we can actually do that in the new build front as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And kind of just lastly, related to that point, what is, can you kind of give me some kind of idea of what the impact on fuel bills is from having a net zero house? And do you think actually there is a responsibility on builders to ensure affordability in the future, given in the UK 12 million people are forecast to fall into fuel poverty after next winter, which is an absolutely shocking statistic?
So in heating terms, you can be reducing the cost of heating by a factor of at least 5 and quite possibly 10 times by building a really energy efficient house. The other energy costs, things like hot water and cooking and those sorts of things, are more comparable even between an energy efficient house and a less energy efficient house. But you can be, certainly in the past we would have said you'd be saving hundreds of pounds a year on an energy efficient house. Now it's probably running into £1,000 or £2,000, maybe even £2,500 a year average, with the massively increasing energy prices. I do think there ought to be an obligation on builders to do it, but there isn't an obligation. There are some relatively simple things that you could do. You could build the cost of energy use into the house, so that when somebody buys a house, that actually covers the first 5-10 years of energy use as well. That would really focus builders on trying to get energy use down, because that would affect their bottom line as well. But although I think there is a moral obligation to do it, I don't see it happening in the near future.
Yeah, I think it's in a long list of things that I think developers need to be pushed more into doing. Yeah, but some interesting thoughts on how change can be either forced or incentivized. Some things that haven't thought
and you're
about.
right. We do need both the carrot and the stick. Yeah,
unfortunately, it definitely has to be. Well, unfortunately or fortunately, I think with all these things in human nature, it is a combination of being forced into do it and like actually seeing the business case for doing it as well.
But I think we also need to have confidence that it can be done. I think a lot of the industry doesn't actually believe it can be done at the moment. So the first part of our job is to prove it can be done, and then we need to get that message out. And then we also need to scale up the volume at which it can be done. And then it becomes much easier for the industry to be able to say, well, okay, if they're doing it, then we could be doing it. And there's a famous story from when Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile. Everybody said it was physically impossible for a human being to run a mile in 4 minutes. But after he did it, there are another 6 people did it in the next 12 months because he proved it could be done. And it's the same sort of thing. We've got to prove it can be done and prove it can be done at scale. And then other people will start to follow.
It's very true, isn't it? It's it expands your mind when someone shows you something can be done. I guess Elon Musk and like what he's doing with space travel and like electric vehicles and things like that are really kind of reinforce that. And even if you think about it on an individual level, it just look at when you were talking about the minute mile, that, you know, even like I'm a cyclist. When I first began cycling, I used to think the idea of cycling 50 kilometers was like bonkers. Yeah. Whereas, you know, now I've gone on cycles for days where they were like 250 to 300 kilometers in a day. And it's just your concept of what's achievable continues. Similarly to setting up your own business. So that's why I'm like super excited to see businesses like Greencore, you know, pushing boundaries and like flying the flag, and I guess improving the business case for doing the right thing, because the right thing is, as you say, to build net zero houses. So I'm very excited, and I'll definitely be like flying the Greencore flag, because I think a lot of people need to know that this is possible, and I'm quite excited to see now that you've kind of have this big injection of investment to see what comes next. Any kind of other things that you'd like to share with us that are kind of exciting things coming up with Greencore?
Well, we are looking to significantly scale up what we're doing. So we've moved into a new factory which is capable of doing a few hundred houses a year, and we'll look for opportunities where we can set up other factories to supply other areas as well. But we will be moving from the relatively small scale that we've been doing to the point where we're doing hundreds and then thousands of houses a year. So that's really exciting. There will be some stunning projects coming forward, and sustainability isn't just about the carbon and energy side. It's all about nature, wildlife, placemaking, health and happiness. And we work within a framework called One Planet Living, which is a great way to remember all the different aspects that go into delivering a sustainable community. So we look for all of our projects to be groundbreaking in all of those different ways as well. So, and if we can do enough of them, I think they'll also start to be catalysts for greener transport, local food production, and all the other things that we need to do to live a more sustainable lifestyle. And I came across a great quote. I was at a presentation last week, and the person doing the presentation gave a definition of sustainability as a series of great opportunities disguised as insoluble problems. And I think that's a great way to think about the sort of things that we're trying to do.
Love it. I think you need to put that up on the wall in the Greencore office.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. I think it might well find its way there.
Maybe you should steal it and pretend it was your quote as well.
Yes. Well, now I've owned up to the fact I've stolen it.
Yeah, maybe we can edit that bit out. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could talk to you all day about these topics, because I have learned quite a lot in the last 30 minutes, and definitely stuff I want to learn a lot more about as well, particularly on embodied carbon. So thank you for sharing so much, and thank you for being brave enough and bold enough to dare to create net zero houses, and then being even braver to raise investment so that you can scale and you know, start putting a big dent in this problem. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the chat today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as well.
Thanks.